He's a journalist, entrepreneur, businessman, author, philanthropist, and award-winning television producer, to name just a few labels that one could affix to him. He's the launcher of satellites and the leader of several major corporations, including having been a director of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He's a true gentleman and a wise counselor. A Yale man, Neal has excelled in nearly every pursuit he has undertaken. As a television producer, Neal has produced more than 1,000 programs for national broadcast and has won many awards for journalistic excellence, including the George Fraser Peabody Award and the Emmy. He's devoted much time to assisting others in their careers, not only through the Fund for American Studies, but also as a board member of the White House Fellows Commission and the Buckley Program at Yale. I want to thank Neal Freeman for enabling us to bring an outstanding individual to speak each summer to the students attending the TFAS programs. And this year's no exception. Neal simply asked that we look for speakers who are particularly skilled at oratory, at sharing ideas in inspired and creative ways, and who make us all think hard. We are most grateful to Neal for his generous gift to establish this all-institute lecture. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for what is going to be a wonderful presentation and I think a lively and informative Q&A session to follow. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Johan Norberg. Johan is someone I think is truly exceptional and a great choice for this lecture. Johan's a native of Sweden. He's an author, a lecturer, a documentary filmmaker. His interests are wide, including entrepreneurship, global trends, intellectual history, and globalization around the world. Johan is the host of Dead Wrong, a short weekly video produced by the Free to Choose Network. He's also recently hosted a two-part documentary, The Real Adam Smith, which aired on public television stations and is available for purchase. He's written over 15 books on a variety of topics, including the best-selling book In Defense of Global Capitalism, which is credited with changing the debate on globalization in the early part of the 2000s. It was translated into 25 languages, including Russian, Chinese, and Turkish. Norberg has been particularly celebrated for his ability to take complex ideas and make them accessible to a broad audience. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow at the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels. He's done trailblazing work which has been recognized in the past by the Atlas Foundation, where he received the distinguished Sir Anthony Fisher Award, and by the German Hayek Stiftung, where he received their gold medal presented by German President Roman Herzog. He's also received the 2019 Julian Simon Prize from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Johan joins us today from his home in Sweden. To ensure the technological smoothness of this program, we've pre-recorded his remarks, but he will be with us as he is now to respond to questions following those remarks, which will last about 20 minutes. You can pose your questions to Johan using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and my colleague Melissa will moderate the discussion to follow. So please, here now is Johan Norberg. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to hold the Neal B. Freeman lecture, and a special thanks to Neal for making this extraordinary lecture series possible. I'm sorry that I can't be with you physically tonight, but you know why. And I have to admit that if I had to pick one place to be, if I couldn't spend this time with you, it's here, in Stockholm, Sweden. Because this is the one place that did not shut down during this pandemic. Sweden did not close borders or businesses or schools, public transportations, gyms, bars. This is the place where we had politicians who said that that would be an insufferable dismantling of civil liberties, and it would be too costly for people, for the economy, and for public health in the long run to shut down the economy. Sweden is the place that had a social democratic prime minister who said that, no, we can't ban all bad behavior. We can recommend social distancing, but it should not be a matter of law, but of common sense. And that in itself tells you that Sweden is not what it is often portrayed as in the American debate. A big government socialist country where the government tells everybody how to live their lives. That's something we often hear about from US leftists who say that America should be more like Sweden. And that is actually the theme of my lecture. When you hear people say that America should be more like Sweden, one interpretation, considering the changes that Sweden has gone through in the past few decades, is that, well, America in that case, if you wanted to be more like this place, you need more free trade, more open markets, you would have to abolish occupational licensing, you would have to reform Social Security from defined benefits to defined contributions, and even introduce individual accounts when it comes to public pensions. You would have to introduce school choice with a system of vouchers to give power over schools to families rather than to bureaucrats and politicians. And you would have to implement low taxes on corporations, actually even lower than the US has today, and abolish taxes on wealth, property, gifts, and inheritance. One data point that tells you that Sweden is not what it used to be is that I recently read a survey that said that 36% of Americans are positive to socialism. Even 16% of Republicans are positive to socialism. Now compare that to Sweden. In Sweden, only 9% say that they call themselves socialists. Why is that? Why are there so few socialists in Sweden? Because we tried it and we learned that that's not the way to build a decent and wealthy future. Göran Persson, the Social Democratic Prime Minister between 1996 and 2006, the most popular and successful Social Democratic Prime Minister in the modern era, he was recently asked by Swedish public television, would he ever call himself a socialist? And he said, oh, no. You just become acquainted with so many crazes. So if that's the case, why do so many Americans and others associate Sweden with socialism? Well, for the same reason you associate it with ABBA and free love. Your perceptions are stuck in the 1970s. At that time, it was reasonable to say that Sweden was moving towards a socialist experiment. But this was an aberration in Sweden's history. An aberration that almost destroyed us. So bear with me when I explain the 3 stages of Swedish history that you need to familiarize yourself with to become an instant Sweden expert and be able to bust the myths that you are so often confronted with, I assume. The 3 stages are the rise, the fall, and the rebirth of the Swedish model. Let's start with a rise. 1870 to 1970 or something like that. Sweden used to be a desperately poor country up until the mid-1800s, where my ancestors in northern Sweden had to mix bark from the trees into the bread to make it last longer, because bad weather meant starvation. But then, in the mid-1800s, a small group of classical liberal politicians wrested control of the country from the aristocrats and from the king. And they implemented a radical classical liberal reform program. They implemented a dismantling of regulations, of taxes, of protectionist trade barriers, and they implemented a small government with freedom for individuals and businesses to go about their business with low taxes and few regulations on international trade. The period between 1870 and 1970 was the period when Sweden had the fastest growth rate in the world, with the one exception of Japan. This was based on small government and an incredibly open Swedish economy, and the fact that Sweden stayed out of 2 world wars. As early as 1950, Sweden, that used to be one of Europe's poorest countries, had already become the 4th richest country on the planet. And there was nothing mysterious about this progress. In 1950, Sweden was also the 5th freest economy in the world. In 1950, taxes were just 21% of Sweden's GDP. That was lower than in the United States, and roughly 10 percentage points below the level in countries like Britain, France, and West Germany. Sweden was now the envy of the world, the small country in Northern Europe that proved to the world that even such geographical outliers could create massive wealth and a decent society and great public health. That was roughly the period between 1870 and 1970. But then we enter stage 2, the fall. And as so often, it was the result of too much self-assurance, the belief that we can do anything. Specifically, politicians saw that there was so much wealth lying around, so they could just begin to redistribute it and take control over businesses and tell them what to do. In this second period, between roughly 1970 and 1995, public spending increased it doubled actually in just 20 years, from around 30% to 60%. And politicians regulated most businesses and the labor market, and they even began toying with ideas about socializing the means of production. We had 2 very influential social democratic intellectuals, Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, both Nobel laureates, who said that Sweden was the best place to build socialism, or at least a socialist welfare state, because all the pillars were there, all the foundations were there. We already had the wealth, so we could start to distribute it. We had a Protestant work ethic, so people would continue to work even if taxes were high, and they would still refuse to take public benefits even though they might be entitled to it. And we had a high level of interpersonal trust. So we trusted politicians not to waste and the people not to abuse benefits. And this is the period in Swedish history that the Bernie Sanders and the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortezes of the world still remembers. Because at the precise moment that socialism attained its highest international prestige in the late 1970s, here was a small democratic country which seemingly proved that socialism and wealth could be combined, because we doubled public spending and we were still incredibly rich. But it was like taking a snapshot of Elvis Presley at the same time and conclude that the way to become the king of rock and roll was to eat banana and bacon sandwiches with prescription drugs. Because these policies that we implemented when we were that rich were the opposite of what got Sweden there in the first place, and it almost destroyed us. In effect, this period when we attained the highest international prestige was Sweden's Atlas Shrugged moment, because this was the moment when the great innovators and entrepreneurs and individualists in Sweden, they began to leave the country because the climate was no longer hospitable to their energy and their entrepreneurship. IKEA, the furniture shop of international fame, left Sweden for the Netherlands. Tetra Pak left for Switzerland. Ingmar Bergman, our great director and movie director, he left for Germany. Björn Borg, another famous sports star, Björn Borg, the famous tennis player, who won Wimbledon 5 times in a row, left for Monaco, just as many other sports champions in Sweden did. This was the period when Sweden, far from proving that socialism worked, proved that it didn't work, because between 1970 and 1995, we went from being richer than other industrialized countries. We had 105% of the OECD average, the OECD club of mostly rich countries. 105% of their wealth to having just 85% of their wealth. It's just like that old joke. How do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you waste most of it. During this second stage of Swedish history, 1970 to 1995, Sweden did not create a single net job in the private sector. And of the 50 biggest companies, none was created after 1970. It all ended in tears in the early 1990s with a financial collapse. For a brief moment in time, the Swedish central bank had to implement a 500% interest rate to defend the Swedish currency. Not 5%, not 50%, but 500% to make sure that not all capital left Sweden. One spectator at the time said that these policies, this democratic socialism that we were experimenting with, was unsustainable, absurd, and rotten and perverse. And that person was none other than the Social Democratic Minister of Finance, Kjell-Olof Feldt. The bottom line is that socialism and big government didn't work in Sweden because it undermined all those foundations that Gunnar and Alva Myrdal had talked about. It undermined the wealth, but also those characteristics, the work ethic and the interpersonal trust. Just take trust. In 1960, the percentage of Swedes who said that it was okay to lie to obtain government benefits was just 5%. By 2000, that percentage had climbed to 43%. Look at sick leave. Now we had a generous sick leave system, and suddenly the country that was, objectively speaking, healthier than almost any other population on the planet was now off sick from work more than any other population on the planet, suspiciously often during large sporting events. During the Soccer World Cup of 2002, men's short-term sick absence increased by 41%, whereas it did not change for women. Actually, Sweden didn't even make it past the 8 finals. Gunnar Myrdal had to confess that Swedes were turning into a population of cheats. And that was the sad fact about this whole experiment. Wealth, well, you can recreate wealth, but it's much more difficult to recreate a healthy, decent culture of work, of trust, of decency and responsibility. And the welfare state that was built on the foundation of that culture began to erode that culture because it didn't come from nowhere. It came from this tradition of open markets, small governments, and individual responsibility. When that was taken away out of the equation, the culture was beginning to leave as well. Gunnar Myrdal's grandson, Stefan Fölster, said in an interview that I made for my documentary, Sweden Lessons for America, which is actually available freely online if you're interested in it. Sweden Lessons for America. Just Google it. Gunnar Myrdal's grandson, Stefan Fölster, said in one of the interviews there, towards the end of his life, my grandfather, Gunnar, questioned some of his lifelong assumptions. He saw that things were not working as they had planned. End of quote. So even the intellectual inspiration for Swedish socialism began to realize that things weren't working out as they had planned. That was the rise and the fall of the traditional Swedish model. But luckily, we also had a third stage, the rebirth. From the early 1990s, Sweden and the Swedish traditional Swedish model was reborn because suddenly we had a consensus from the left to the right, from the center-right to the Social Democrats, even sometimes the post-communists, agreed that this model didn't work and we had to get back to the future by reducing the size of government and opening up the economy again. And these politicians, during a brief moment in time, they reduced the size of government by a third. They reduced taxes and abolished taxes on wealth, property, gifts, and inheritance. In fact, we had a post-communist party that supported the plan to abolish taxes on gifts and inheritance. They began to privatize many companies, liberalized product markets, created more free trade than before. We entered the European Union, which gave us a more reliable long-term defense for free trade, more competition, and in the European Union, suddenly Sweden became a voice for restraint in public finances and for more deregulation and opposed to centralization, because we had seen how such policies had failed back home. Swedish politicians implemented school voucher system so that private schools got the same public funding as the public ones. And they, from the left to the right, they agreed on social security reform from defined benefits to defined contributions. So there are equations in the law so that when the economy is not doing well, pensions are also automatically adjusted down. So it is sustainable no matter what happens to the economy. And it also gives people an obvious incentive to have policies that increases growth in the economy. Between 1980 and 2000, Sweden improved by 2 points on the 10-point scale of economic freedom of the world, this International Index on Economic Freedom. 2 points, it might not sound that much, but compare that to 0.5 points for Reagan's United States and 1.8 points for Thatcherite Britain. Of course, Sweden started from a lower level, but it was still a fairly steep climb. And the result was that Sweden began to grow faster than other countries again. Between 1970 and 1990, we grew almost 1% slower, and then we had the terrible financial crisis that almost destroyed us. After 1995, Sweden has grown almost 1% faster every year. Between 1970 and 1995, when the world thought of Sweden as a workers' paradise, inflation ate almost all of the wage increases. Since 1995, on the contrary, real wages have increased almost 70%. So that's Sweden's real story and Sweden's lesson for America and the rest of the world. Free markets made us rich. Socialism almost destroyed it, and now we are getting back to the future. It's not that we don't have any major problems left, but now we have the normal problems of a normal, mature Western European welfare state, rather than a very eccentric government with very eccentric problems. Now, our social spending is 26% of GDP, like Germany, and below countries like France with 38%. We still have a larger welfare state than the United States, but I'll let you in on a dirty little secret, which is of great interest to American leftists who think that they can build a big government by squeezing the rich, as they do in Sweden. No, we don't. We don't squeeze the rich in Sweden because we found out in the 1970s and 1980s that they were too few and too important to the economy. And they stopped innovating, they stopped building new companies, and the big ones we had for Switzerland and for Monaco and for the Netherlands. The dirty secret of the Swedish welfare state is that we squeeze the poor. Because the poor and the middle classes, they are loyal taxpayers. They don't dodge taxes and they don't have tax lawyers that make sure that they pay as little as possible. In fact, if you compare Sweden to the US, you see that our system is much more regressive than your system. People earning less than half the average income pay 31% of the taxes, the income taxes in Sweden, compared to 14% in the US. The US top 10 of taxpayers pay 45% of income taxes. In Sweden, they pay only 27%. And then we get almost as much in Sweden in excise taxes and value-added taxes on consumption, a VAT of 24% on average. Because the Swedish Social Democrats, they realized early on that you can have a big government or you can make the rich pay for it all. You can't have both. Pick one. So that's the lesson of Sweden. Free markets made us rich. Socialism almost destroyed us. Yes, we can have a bigger welfare state than you can have, only if we have very rough, unregulated global capitalism in Sweden that creates this wealth, and we make sure that the poor and the middle classes pay the taxes for the goods that they are getting. You pay for your own benefits, which only really hands the decisions and the money to bureaucrats and politicians. It's not that they're getting anything for free. They're paying for everything themselves. So to sum up everything, I can give the last word to Kjell-Olof Feldt, again, the Social Democratic Minister of Finance during these pivotal years, 1983 to 1990. He said, and I quote, "That whole thing with democratic socialism was absolutely impossible. It just didn't work. There was no other way to go than market reform." End of quote. And that's Sweden's lesson for America. Thank you very much.